It is a great pleasure to introduce our host, Professor Holly Rader. Holly is a clinical professor of management at Kellogg. She's also our managing director for executive education. Holly, how are you doing today?
I am well, and so energized by the many different questions and comments in the chat, curiosities about the brain and how the brain works. And so I think that we are in for a great webinar today. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Welcome, Kellogg community, to our webinar today focused on using the brain in business. And we will be discussing the frontiers of neuroscience and how that applies to a few facets of business, as Melissa foreshadowed. It is a delight to welcome to the webinar Professor Moran Cerf, a great colleague and friend who is a professor of the business of neuroscience. I hope that you take occasion to click on his bio and learn more, because you'll see that what Moran really is he's a polymath. He studied physics, he studied philosophy and has degrees in those areas. He has a PhD in neuroscience. He is the faculty in residence at the American Film Institute, where he provides scientific expertise for things that come out of Hollywood. He's starred in movies. He facilitates conferences. He's started new ventures. He spent about a decade as the hacker for hire that firms would call upon to test their own cybersecurity. He's a fascinating individual and just absolutely on the frontier of where neuroscience is going and how that's going to be relevant for you in the future of business. Moran, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, we would love if you started off with giving us a little bit of a background about what exactly is neuroscience and, leading us through some of these frontiers.
Perfect. So I should say in advance that if you hear me speak too fast, it's not a buffering issue on your end. It's actually how I speak. So I will do my best to speak slower, but I'm already anticipating that I'm going to have to catch my breath at some point and say, oh, slow down, because that's a common thing for me. OK, so as Holly said, I'm a professor at Kellogg, but my background is in neuroscience. And that's strange. It's not common. Kellogg is one of the few schools that actually have a neuroscientist among the faculty. And it is a testament to the forward-looking approach. And it's driven by the fact that the industry, primarily marketing industry, but not exclusively, management, hiring, finance, a lot of industries are also interested in that. They're all shifting towards hiring neuroscientists to positions that historically were occupied by people who did business management, data analytics, and research. And the leading industries right now are the tech industries. Silicon Valley, Facebook, Google, Amazon have a lot of neuroscientists working on their themes. And also, they're hiring a lot of my former students to run kind of things that were traditionally done by marketing managers. That's one big industry. And the other one is Hollywood. Hollywood is really big on hiring neuroscientists to help them. So we thought it would be useful to explain to you what is this trend about, where is it heading, and what you should know about neuroscience in business. And I wanted to focus on 3 ideas from neuroscience that all emerged in the last 10 years. And my view is that they're going to shape the way we do business in the next 10 years. So before I dive into those, I want to explain briefly what it means to have neuroscience in business. And the idea is that we can get an understanding of people's personality, thinking, decision-making, planning, emotions, not by asking them questions, but rather by observing their brain when they answer those questions or when they are doing the things that we care about, like making decisions. And the tools that we use are tools that essentially are placed on your head or look at your head from distance, but get an insight into the working of the internal parts of your brain. So they look at neurons and brain cells and infer something about your thinking from inside your brain. And the simplest way to think about it is that if you used to run surveys or used to do focus groups, understand your customers, or evaluate your employees, or to hire, you can now supplement those or add to the roster of things that you use some tools that actually look inside the brain of the customer or of the manager or of a team and learn things that you may not be able to glean otherwise, like what they actually want, what are their pain points, what prices are they willing to pay or not for something. That's in marketing. In management, we have projects that look at the brain of senior executives and try to understand the optimal brain state, when they should make decisions so they maximize their cognitive capacity or help them improve decision making. In entrepreneurship, we have a study that came out recently that looked at the brains of investors while they were viewing pitches by entrepreneurs, like kind of like a Shark Tank experience. You have an entrepreneur presenting an idea to an investor, and we look at the brain of investor and try to predict whether they're going to invest in the idea, how much, and what is it about the connection between the entrepreneur, the founder, and the investor that makes some ideas catch and some don't. But the dominant field that neuroscience is capturing right now is content assessment. So if your field has something to do with movies, commercials, political speeches, and so on, that's where a lot of neuroscience is going.
So Moran, I think you anticipated well that folks with, as you know, the global audience would love a little slower. And if you could just say again the last piece about, was it content?
Sure. So the primary use of neuroscience right now in business is in content assessment. Essentially, what neuroscientists can do is they can look at the brain of people when they are viewing content, when they're watching a movie, when they're looking at a commercial on TV, when they're listening to a political speech, and learn from the brains of the audience how well did the message resonate, how good is the movie, how likely are people to actually buy the product in the ad just by looking at the brain of people who watch that. Hollywood is using that a lot to actually decide how to cut the movie. So you have a movie running and they're looking at the brain of audiences while they're cutting the movie and editing it in the editing room, and they decide if the hero should fall in love with the vampire or the wolf based on what's happening in the brains of the audience. So that's the field that dominates that. And I want to give you an example that would kind of illustrate the power of that. Imagine that you're running a survey and you ask a question of your, say, audience, and the question has a scale of 1 to 10, and one person, when they get to question 3, they're kind of debating if they should place a 6 or an 8. They're not sure. They say it's maybe a 6, maybe it's an 8. I'm not really sure. Fine, I'm going to just put a 7. If you see this 7, as a person assessing the survey, you have no idea that in their mind it was maybe 6, maybe 8, I don't know. It looks like a regular 7. If you had access to their brain, you can actually see the confusion or the ambivalence and learn something about the weight of each answer and understand something more than just what it means, but also what kind of went in their mind when they were choosing that. So that's just one example. But now let's head to the kind of main dish of today, which is 3 really cool ideas that fascinate neuroscientists these days that I hope will excite you as well. So we were focusing on 3 functions of the brain, and those functions had a shift in perspective in the last decade. And with this perspective shift, they also became a business kind of idea that we can use. So the first one we tackle is memory. About 8 years ago, our thinking about memory has shifted from a simple view that says that memories work kind of like a vault. You go to an experience, you store it in your vault, and from then on, when you need this memory, you kind of load it and you can use it, to an understanding that when you use memories, you actually change them. So every time you load the memory that's in your brain, you kind of keep it floating and you talk about the memory, but you also expose it to new perspectives that will leak into it and be rewritten and overwrite the original one as you're done using it. So essentially, every time you use a memory, you load it, change it, and overwrite it. And this is not a bug. This is a feature of the brain that allows us to actually change. It means that we can actually take experiences and revisit them again and again by talking about them and look at them differently. This is why therapy works. You go to a therapist, you talk about your bad breakup, they would ask you a question, you would load the memory, you would tell them about this experience, they would intervene and give you new perspective and help you overwrite the original with a different view. And over time, you will actually remember the content, but see it differently. Why is it relevant right now to business? Because a number of studies that we've been doing in the last couple of years, but go back to the year 2004, put together with our understanding of memories that came from 2012, suggests that we can actually use memory changes to actually change your narrative for life. I'll give an example from a study that we're conducting right now that really speaks to that. So in this study, we bring people to the lab, and we ask the subject to look at two pictures of two individuals, two, let's say, men that the subject doesn't know. And we ask the question, who do you find more attractive? The person on the left or the person on the right? So the person looks at the two of them, the subject kind of says, maybe the guy on the left. And then we give him or her the card with the picture they chose. And then we ask them one more question. Can you tell me why you chose this person? Explain to me what made you like this person. So the person looks at the card they chose and they say, I really like his smile. We say, fantastic, put that to the side, let's try another one. We pick two new cards with two new pictures, ask them again, who do you find more attractive? They make a choice, we give them the choice they made, and we ask them to explain why they made this choice. This goes on for about an hour with many, many choices. And from that perspective, it's a simple experiment. You make a decision and you explain it. But there's a trick here, and the trick is really critical. The trick is that the person that we use to give you the cards isn't just a regular guy. He's a magician that we hired, and he uses sleight of hands in 1 in every 20 trials or so to actually give you the card you didn't choose. So if you chose the card on the left, he would give you the card on the right. And what we see is that first, people rarely notice that they received the choice they didn't make. And second, and more interesting, they then go on and explain to us why this was their choice. So they chose A, we give them B, they take B, and they explain why this was their choice. So if you think about it from the perspective of the brain, in the course of about 10 seconds, the brain made a decision, stored it in a memory, was asked to explain it, load whatever was in the memory, which wasn't what was stored originally there, and came up with an answer, which means that our interpretation of our choices is separated from the choice themselves. And when I ask you why, you're going to come up with an answer on the spot to things that may not have been placed in your brain by you. This study that originally came up with two colleagues of mine, Lars Hall and Peter Johansson from Sweden, has been replicated since then by many, many groups. And we show that we can actually change political choices, musical preferences, even choices that we think are at the heart of who we are. And the point of that, from my perspective, is that it shows us that the brain actually has two different systems for deciding and for explaining. We can actually now name those systems and see how they operate. And it can be used to actually make you see things differently or make choices differently. And now I'm going to give you a business example that would be clear. Imagine I ask you to go to the supermarket with a list of items that I want you to purchase. So there's like milk and bread and maybe butter, and you kind of go to the shelf and you make a choice and you make another choice and you make another choice, you put them in a basket and you go to the checkout. And at some point between the moment you chose, let's say, one toothpaste over the other, I sneak into your basket and I replace the choices with the one you didn't choose. There's a likely chance that you will not notice that I replace your preferences, and you will buy whatever is in the basket, because as long as the choices are not important for you, you easily can confuse one for the other. But more importantly, if I'm a marketing manager and I stop you on the way outside and I say, we're interested in a focus group where we understand why you made your choices. Give me answers why you chose this toothpaste and not the other. You're not going to say, I have no idea. You're not going to say, actually, I chose the other one. You're going to explain to me why this was your choice. And here's the coolest part. What we learned from our study is that the more I ask you to explain your choice, even if it wasn't yours, you're going to convince yourself that this was your choice, such that if you come back tomorrow to the supermarket, asked again to buy toothpaste, you're likely to actually buy the one you didn't choose before, just because I asked you to explain it. So what I want you to take from that is that we can change memories. It's very easy as long as they're not critical choices. We can actually replace them and you will commit to the new one. And more importantly, I want to say that you should beware of asking why, because the key moment where things happen here is that when I ask you why, you actually commit to the new idea, explain it to yourself, and lock it in your memory. You load the memory, write it, and change it. So when I ask you why you do something, if you don't really have a good answer, and you come up with one on the spot, your brain will think this is the truth, and from then on, this will be reality. I have a big kind of a poster right at my doorstep that I look at every time I leave my place that says, don't believe everything you think. And the world we're heading towards right now is a world where this might be jeopardy. Our thoughts could be accessed by outside people, changed, and we are not able to fully be in charge of our own memories. And that is risky. It offers opportunities to change things that are terrible for us. offers opportunities for businesses to actually help people shape their narrative such that they would commit to things that happen to them and like them rather than just keep rehashing the bad experiences, but also offered some creepy notions if I can actually make you do things that you didn't want to do and have you own it as if it's yours. So the first idea is that.
Maran, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's the next generation of what we studied in cognitive dissonance, so to speak. So, could you elaborate on why you refer to this as memory and not a broader set of features, including motivation?
So I think that we could label it differently. The answer is that the brain doesn't really have labels. The brain doesn't really know, we call things, I felt it, or I processed that, or I think, and the brain just has neurons firing and doesn't know that this one is called to feel, this one is called to be creative. But if you look at the brain sites, at the areas that actually make this shift, the areas that actually rewrite, they're the ones typically associated with memory. So we call them memory sites, but that's our interpretation of the brain. The brain doesn't know that this is memory. It just does things, and we name them based on the phenomena that happens. So we call it memory just because of that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, first idea. Second idea, and they become, I think, extremely science fiction-y as we advance. The second one is an idea that emerged either in the year 2015, or there are hints towards this idea in the 1970s, but they didn't have a name for that back then. And even now, we don't really have a name for this. So I would call it a sensory addition, but this might change in a few years when it becomes a more kind of established field. And the idea behind it is that we can actually add sensors to humans. So here's what I mean by that. Neuroscience 101, our brain sits in our head, but it doesn't really occupy the entire space. The space the brain takes is much smaller, about 2 fists is the size of the brain compared to your head. And it's surrounded by water. It's a little colder than the outside world in your head. It's dark there. The brain doesn't really see the world. It doesn't really smell the world. It doesn't hear the world. It doesn't have any access to the world. The only way the brain experiences the world is through our senses. Our senses are kind of like devices that sample the world, turn it into the language of the brain, and then the brain looks at its own language and makes meaning out of that. So think about seeing, for example. Your eyes capture photons from the environment. They turn them into the language of the brain, which is the language of electrochemical signals. Send it to the back of your brain, where the brain makes meaning out of that and calls it seeing. It doesn't really see directly. It uses the eyes as devices to sample the world and turn it in. Now, our eyes are very limited. They're not really seeing what's out there. Our eyes see only a fraction of the spectra of light that's out there, about 1/10 trillionth of what's out there. So most things we don't see. Right now, I bet that many of you have cell phones in your room. Those cell phones have rays of light that goes into a cell tower, but you don't see it. It's not part of your reality. You can sense it with a device, but you don't really, if you pass your hands, you don't really get kind of obstacled by any of those. If there were a bat in the room, for example, the bat would see those. The bat would actually echolocate the rays and it would fly between them because they're parts of the bat's reality. But the interesting thing is that the brain of a bat and the brain of a human work in the same way. Of course, humans' brains much more complicated, has more neurons, but the building blocks of brains, neurons, are essentially the same. They work in a similar fashion, which suggests that maybe we can take the world and use different devices to sample it that speak to the brain and give us access to more of it. Essentially, the question that started it is, can we take, for example, the eyes of the bat and plug them into the brain of a human and start having humans who see the rays of cell reception? Or take the birds have in their head magnetometers. So birds, when they fly, they actually sense the magnetic field of Earth. They know exactly where north is all the time. This means that they have a device that speaks to their brain and tells their brain where north is. They just feel north. Can we take this device and plug it into the brains of humans, and suddenly you have a human being that knows and feels where north is? Now, why is it so cool? First, it allowed us in the last couple of years to actually take people who lost some senses and restore those. So you may have heard of the cochlear implants. Those are devices that work with people who lost their hearing because their ears malfunction. You give them a device that essentially replicates the way the ear works. It senses the changes in molecular vibrations in the air and speaks directly to the brain and gives the brain signal that comes from the outside world, such that their brain can relearn to hear. It takes a few months for the brain to learn the mapping again, because it's not the same as the ears. They don't get necessarily the same level of sound quality, but they get to hear after they were deaf for a while. A few weeks ago, there was a paper published in one of the most prestigious journals that talks about retinal implants. So taking basically replacing the eye, taking blind people, give them new eyes that give their brain the ability to see movements and shadows and colors. So we're heading towards basically starting to take senses as an offer that nature gave us and replacing them. Now, how do I tie it to business? In a few experiments that have been done in the last couple of years by colleagues of mine, including myself, we've been toying with the idea of using the brain's power to solve complex problems, to identify signals in really loud, noisy environments and make meaning of them, to identify content. So the idea is that your ears are fantastic in taking all of the noise that come out, send it to the brain, and the brain is somehow miraculously able to separate the sound of one person from another, from the wind outside or from a car moving. It somehow finds meaning in that very, very fast. And if we can turn things into senses, we can let the brain do this magic where it solves the problem of finding meaning in it. I'll give you a concrete example. In a study by a colleague of mine, he had people wear vests on their body. The vest has multiple pressure points that press on their body back and in the back and in the front. And he gives them a tablet and he turns the vest on and they feel something. They feel maybe pressure on the left shoulder and a little bit on the right side of the chest. And then he turns the vest off and on the tablet appear 2 arrows. And he says, for the feeling you just had right now, what's the answer? Go left or go right? People say, I have no idea. I just felt something. I don't know how to map it. He says, just guess then. If you don't know, just make a guess. The person says, okay, I'm guessing left. And immediately a message appears on the screen and says, correct, you just earned $1 for this right choice. Let's try again. The vest is turned on again. This time they feel something in the lower back and in the belly. And again, 2 arrows appear with a question. For this feeling, should you go left or right? The person says, this time I'm going right. And they get feedback, maybe correct or incorrect. They do this for about an hour. For about an hour, every couple of seconds, they feel something in their body and they make a decision. And over time, they get better. In the beginning, they just guess. They kind of hit or miss every couple of trials. But over time, they get better. They start to say, every time I feel something in my right side, or my right side, I feel I should go left. If I feel something on my left side, I feel I should go right. The belly button indicates I should go left, and so on. And they do better, and we can see that they actually start earning money. Instead of just kind of hovering around zero, winning, losing, they actually start earning money. Now, here's the cool part. Unbeknownst to them, the feeling in the body isn't just random. What it is a projection of the S&P 500 into a feeling in their body. And what they're doing is they're making buy and sell choices. So these people learned essentially to invest in the stock exchange, not by knowing the stock exchange even, just by learning to feel it. And they use the brain's amazing power in finding meaning in there. So as long as there's some signal in the data that they're given to their body, the brain is fantastic in finding meaning in it. The brain does what it always does. It looks at a lot of data and finds meaning in it. So if there is meaning there, if there is some signal in the data that was chosen specifically for this study, the brain should find it relatively fast. And now we're playing with basically replicating the same study with marketing data, with data from big organizations on hierarchy and see kind of if there's somehow failure of communication. The point is that we take data out there, turn it into a feeling, into a sense, and have the brain learn to make meaning out of that. We know that the brain takes little time to find meaning in there, and now we're harnessing that to actually essentially use the brain to do something that is amazing, solve problems for us without even knowing what those problems are. And I say one more thing before I move to the third one, and the coolest one, which is if you know anything about machine learning, if any of you have experienced machine learning, this is basically what machine learning is. Taking examples, blasting a machine with them, and telling the machine whether it's correct or incorrect, and having the machine over time learn how to find meaning in them. So what machine learning is taking the brain's amazing ability to find meaning and implementing it in a machine. And what our studies are showing right now, that we can actually bring it back to the brain and beat the machines on finding meaning in signals. So as long as there is meaning there, our human subjects are beating the machines in that. So that's kind of one testament to where humans are still better than AI. We find meaning faster, better, and more accurately if there is meaning in there. So what I'm seeing is, in a way, a combination of machine learning and human thinking that will surpass either of them alone. And now I'm going to head to the third one.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
And the third one is the one that I personally feel most attached to and like the most. And the tagline for this one would be that we're now starting to access dreams, read them, and change them. So if you've been, like me, interested in dreams, you probably know that despite how fascinated we are by them, we don't know much about them. Essentially, for millennia, people have been interested in dreams. You can find poems from many centuries ago that speak to dreams, hieroglyphs in caves, wars were waged because of dreams, historical documents about dreams are prevalent. At the same time, we really didn't know what's going on in their dreams. 100 years ago, Freud and Carl Jung, they made a career from looking at your dreams, but all they had was the story that you tell them when you wake up. They didn't really access your dreams. They had to have you tell them what you think your dream was about. And what we know is that the story you tell when you wake up is not necessarily accurate. It's flawed. It's filtered through your awake self. I'll give you an example that would make it clear. In the early 1920s, 1930s, people were asked about their dreams, and they reported their dreams in black and white. And as soon as Hollywood started making movies in color, everyone shifted to talk about their dreams in color. So somehow, because we think of dreams like a movie, we just thought, okay, movies are in black and white, so my dreams are in black and white. Once movies had colors, dreams started having colors in them, suggesting that how we think about dreams is not really how they were, but more like what language we have as we wake up that can talk about a movie that we have seen in our mind. But for the last 15, 20 years, neuroscientists have started to essentially poke into the brain of dreaming people and extract the content. So what I'm known for as a neuroscientist is a method that I use very kind of much in most of my work that's called single neuronal coding. It's a method that allows us to actually look at the brains of people while they're sitting in the operating room and have a neurosurgeon open their brain and stick electrodes inside. So we work with surgeons who perform surgery on people. During the surgery, the person is awake and their head is open, and the surgeon places electrodes inside to look at the source of a problem that they have and identify the origin of it. And we use those electrodes that are there while the person is waiting for the surgeon to understand what's going on, to also run studies on them and actually look at the brain from the inside. And in some of the studies we run, we actually find brain cells that code thoughts in their brain. So we can actually see your brain when you think of your mom or your dad or the Eiffel Tower or a brand that you know. And the point is that we now can see things that are in your brain that you might not even communicate to us verbally. We see your thoughts as they emerge in your mind. And where it ties all together is that in the last couple of years, neuroscientists have been starting to use these methods to actually decode and extract the dreams and see the content, and then they can wake you up and ask you what you think your dream was about and compare what we predict your dream is about, what you think. And if you're not accurate, we can actually give you information and say, we think that you actually also had your best friend in your dream, and say, oh, now that you remind me of that, yes, it's true, and basically get more accurate description of your dreams. We can do that by looking inside, or colleagues of mine at Berkeley are actually looking at the brain from the outside and still getting access to the illustration of the dream. The point is, we get access to your dreams, but that's only half the story. The coolest and final part is that in looking at your dreams, we can actually also start changing them. So a number of colleagues of mine have been trying to play with the idea of using all kinds of cues that come from the outside to actually navigate your dream content while you're experiencing it. So we use, for instance, smells to make you go with your dream to a certain direction. It's not one-to-one mapping. It's not that if I spray the smell of the ocean, you dream of the ocean. Usually we can navigate somehow the valence. We can make you have a positive dream or a negative dream, or something that kind of brings you a familiar experience versus not. But the idea is that we can actually change your awake behavior by nudging your dream. The most extreme version I know of is a study by a colleague of mine from 2015, where she took smokers, had them go to sleep, take a nap in the lab, and sprayed into their nose the smell of nicotine that evoked the thinking about smoking, and immediately after the smell of rotten eggs that makes the brain essentially have some kind of a pairing of smoking with a negative experience. And when these guys woke up, they felt less of an urge to smoke. So she changed behaviors of people without them even knowing what's going on, just by doing something to their brain while they were sleeping in a stage of sleep that's kind of important for memory consolidation and retrieval. All of that is to say is that we're now venturing into sleep, and we're starting to look at your dreams, at your memories, how they interact, how your come up with a story, and we essentially getting more and more accurate in decoding the content and shaping it. And this, business-wise, to me, is an entire new domain of world of ideas. So first of all, it's a new canvas. We can think about Hollywood. We can actually have you go to sleep and dream a dream by Spielberg. Or we can share a dream. So you go on a date and you come back home, and instead of just falling asleep side by side, you actually share some experience together even afterwards. Or we can use that to actually remove a bad dream. So if you have an experience that you don't want, we can change it on the spot. So take away from that. And if we pair that with the idea that we can actually change behavior that stays with you when you're awake, you can now use the sleeping brain as a medium for behavior change that will last longer and stay with you and actually affect your outcome. So I think that here I see that business-wise, both as a new commodity, a new canvas for ideas. Think about VR compared to dreams. VR is pretty cool, but at the end of the day, you know that you have goggles on your eyes, and if the monster is scaring you, you can just do this and it's over. Dreams are real. There's a saying by Freud that I really like. Dreams are real as long as they last. Can we say more about life? And I think that that's where we're heading, to using dreams as a canvas for content and potentially as a mechanism to change behavior. Those are my three ideas that I think are going to be relevant for you. I want to finish with one big thought that I typically use for myself as an analogy that reminds me of where we're heading, and then I'm going to open it for everyone to ask questions. All of those ideas, and trust me, I was struggling to pick only three. There are so many cool ones. They suggest one key thing that I think is important, which is that our brain isn't exactly the speaking part of us. Like when we talk and we say, I'm doing this or I want that, we're speaking for our brain, but essentially there are parts of the brain that do things that we don't have full access to. Memories are sitting there. We don't really know how they got there. We use them, but we don't really control them. Dreams, of course, happen to us, even though we think that they're our possession. In a way, we're viewers, not the director of the dreams. And similar senses, they suggest that the world is what it is, but what we know is that the world is much richer than what we can experience, and we're mostly a visitor of a fragment of what the world is. All of those suggest that we don't really have access to the entire experience, but we still think we do. And that's the message that I want to finish with. And I want to tell you a story that will help there. It's a story about Galileo Galilei, who in the year 1616, so nearly 400 and something years ago, shifted his telescope to the moons of Jupiter that he was observing and tried to predict where they're going to orbit the planet. And he couldn't predict it accurately because the equations didn't line up with what he saw. The observations didn't match. And as much as he tried to explain what's going on, the only answer he could use was that we had the entire solar system wrong. That sun is the center of the solar system, and we are just one planet out of many. We're not the center of the universe. And this, to him, to Galileo, was a dethronement of humankind. What does it mean that we're not the center of the universe? What does it mean that we're just one rock orbiting another one? It felt terrible to him. But when he embraced this idea, when he accepted it, it allowed him to actually see the wide reaches of the universe and see far out there, much more than we saw before. And in the 400 years that followed since, we've been exploring a lot of the world thanks to the idea that says that we're not the most important thing in it. In the same way, the last decade has told neuroscientists that we might not be the center of our own little universe, that we might not be the center of our own head. And this is something that we try to reject quickly. We say, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean that things happen to me, that I don't know my thoughts, that my memories can be changed, that my dreams are not under my control? It feels difficult for us. But I suggest that if we apply the same idea, we'll be a little bit more humble on explaining our own thoughts and feeling that we're in control and explaining everything and saying, I'm consistent and I have to understand why I'm doing what I'm doing fully. And if not, then there's a failure. We'll be able to understand the most interesting thing in the universe, which is us. Thank you.
Moran, thank you. There is a wide-ranging fascination with the topic today, and I know that there are some very big questions that have to do with ethics and what I'll call individual agency, and I'm going to come to those. But I thought maybe we would just start with some of the questions that want to understand a little bit more of brain science. So, for example, one of the recent questions and comments has to do with sleep time and the question of whether or not it is true that sleep is a time for our brain to rest, to re-energize for the next round of activities. And how might some interference with the dream process, the otherwise organic dream process, influence that?
So that's a great question. It has a lot of things in it. Generally, sleep is a lot of things. So sleep has numerous phases or stages, we call them. And in one of them, our body actually builds muscles. In another one, we calibrate things. Another one, memories get restored. And then another one is dreams. And we don't know exactly what all of them do, but we have a good sense that they're all important, because if we break some of them, we see the outcomes afterwards. For example, dreams, one of the classical studies on creativity, asks people to solve a problem and ask them to go to sleep if they can't solve it for a few hours, and then wake up and reflect on the same problem. And what you see is that if they happen to dream in those, say, 2 hours of nap, they're much more likely to solve the problem. Dream helps us kind of shift perspective and see things from different angles, and then we come up with a new perspective. If you slept for 2 hours but didn't dream, you're not getting better. Or if you just stayed 2 hours awake, just didn't look into the problem, you're not. So the dream is key for that. All of that to say is that we know that sleep is really important, and we know that each stage does something else, and we need all of them in the right proportion. And the reason I'm saying that is because humans are terrible at sleep. It's one of the few things that we're really quick to take over and do bad things to. In fact, of all the animals in nature, humans are the only animal that delays sleep. All other animals, when they're tired, they go to sleep. Humans are the only one that says, no, one more email, or just 5 more minutes of this book, and I'm gonna then go to sleep. And that's affecting our brain negatively, and is something that we are, as we learn more about kind of the things that are affecting other things, like comorbidities, things that are the outcome of not sleeping, turns out that it's also affecting us in other health domains. So if I were to give one advice to a lot of people here, one business advice would be that there's a lot of interesting ideas in the world of sleep that could help humans actually maximize their performance if we just help them sleep better, wake up in the right time, know when to sleep, know how to do it. And essentially that all of you should consider sleep as not as a kind of thing that you do when other things are over, but as part of your day that is really important. I jokingly tell a lot of my students that I want them to sleep the way to the top. And that's kind of my advice to a lot of people who listen to us right now.
Yeah. And perhaps a little bit of a joke about the top being your head.
Yes.
So would you say a little bit more about the brain's role in creativity and in problem solving?
Sure. So essentially, the brain is really good in solving problems. It's really good in solving problems in two ways. And creativity is one of those two ways that requires you to essentially look at the problem from different angles. There are some people that are intuitively better at that. Some situations where we are more likely to be better at that. For example, we can find for each and every person here the perfect state that allows them to be even more creative than other moments in their day. And altogether, the key thing there is that it requires us many times to shift scales. So what it means is that many times we're used brain-wise to causes an effect happening very, very fast. So if I do this, and the sound came immediately after I clapped, as a baby, I learned that these probably are connected and that one causes the other. If I did this and the sound came 5 minutes later, I wouldn't put the one and one together easily. It would be hard for my brain to grasp that one thing led to the other. This is why a lot of us have a hard time with things that take very many years to happen. Climate change is a good example. We do things right now, and the outcome is going to be a generation further. So we don't really see the effect right away. All of this to say is if we are able to change the scales, if we're able to basically make the brain accept that one thing that we did right now led to something that happened 5 minutes later, then it's more likely that we'll see the connection between them. And creativity is basically the two systems, the one that creates cause and effects and the one that seeks explanations, working in concert and saying, okay, I do something else, it leads to this outcome, and I can actually connect the dots. Effectively, there are actually sites in the brain that are more likely to yield that, and it's basically removing barriers. And if we allow for that to happen, then we are more likely to think creatively and find new solutions. And now neuroscience actually explains to us how to find those states in each and every person and how to maximize them.
Thank you for that. So there's a set of questions that I'm going to try to creatively combine. And they have to do one with creativity as we age. One has to do with some of the biological and biochemical features that may or may not lead to Alzheimer's. Some of it has to do with the habits of playing puzzles like crossword and Sudoku to train the brain. But what I think that they all have in common is a question about brain health and what, in addition to sleep, might be within our control that we could do or that you'd give us advice on to have longevity of brain health.
Okay, so that's one of the most important topics right now that gets a lot of funding from neuroscientists, as a lot of people that are very wealthy get older and they're willing to give a lot of money. So it's not surprising that there's the Paul Allen Institute, the Bill Gates Institute, that all look at those ideas because those guys get older and they're now willing to invest a lot of money in the aging brain. The reality is that the brain changes as we age, and that obviously things become harder for the brain as we get older. Primarily, when we're younger, the brain is a lot more plastic and it changes much more frequently, such that if we have a problem, the brain creates a solution quickly after. As we get older, the brain kind of becomes more rigid and changes are harder. So we're stuck with a lot more concrete things that we cannot change as easily. And problems actually lead to deficits rather than just our brain coming up with a new solution. But the positive answer is that because it's such a rich field, we're getting better and better in understanding how to increase or enhance or speed up the process of regeneration. So actually teach the brain how to recover from states. And also we're learning in a way how to slow down the decay. I don't have a super positive answer here. It's not that that we have the answers. In fact, if we look at kind of disease all over the place, we're getting better in treating most things, heart attack, cancer. We're getting better in doing them. When it comes to mental health and brain problems, we're actually not getting good as much. And those become more prevalent, partially because we also get older. So we mostly get to ages that we didn't get to before. Our brain has enough time to get to the stages that allow it to decay, unfortunately. But at the same time, I think that because so much effort is going into this thing, there are kind of hopeful solutions. I will say one thing that would be risky to say, but I will say it. A lot of the apps and games and tools that are available out there that supposedly if you play this game for 2 hours will make your brain better are typically not as successful as just eating healthy, sleeping well, kind of having social interactions and things that you presumably do anyhow. There are a number of studies that kind of look at tools, games that make you have better memory or increase your skills and so on. And what they show is that people get better in the game, but they're not really translating it to memory outside. This is still a controversy. So by saying that, I'm taking a risk because there are a number of studies, very strong ones, that kind of debunk a lot of the kind of key ideas, but there are also a few that have success, especially with senior populations and slowing down the decay, which is useful. But as a whole, if you have to invest in one thing, I would say invest in your health generally, and it will leak into your brain rather than kind of think, okay, the brain is now going to be solved by just one thing.
Thank you for that. So the next broad area is, again, bringing together a number of people's very specific questions that all point to a question of, freedom of mind, freedom of thought, and our rights, our agency. And I wonder if you would address the question of the ethics of influencing what's in people's brains as you've described through neuroscience.
That is my preferred question. That's the one I was hoping that's going to come up. So I'm in a business school as a neuroscientist because I think that the leaders of the world are among our students and alumni, and they have the ability to shape the coming years when it comes to how we do things. I think that unfortunately, a lot of times politicians are busy thinking about the next election or the next budget. They don't have time to think long-term, 10, 20, 50 years ahead. And a lot of businesses are the ones who took it on themselves to think about big kind of ideas that are farther ahead. And so our students and alumni would be those people. And I think that the ethical questions that emerge from the topics I mentioned are important. because for each idea that I mentioned to you, you could probably sense my excitement, but there's also a very dark side to it. If I can change your memories, I can write ideas into your brain that would make you wake up and suddenly want to buy more Captain Crunch and not know that it wasn't your idea, it was someone else planting the idea in your mind. If I can make your brain solve problems for me, I can start using your brain power for resources, mining things that are not your thoughts. All of those ideas are not available yet, but they're available in the sense that researchers are kind of exploring them and trying to get to them. And I think that it's the right time for every person who is in this gathering to think whether they want it or not, and to weigh in on that, because here neuroscientists don't have a better say. It's an issue that all of us should, as citizens, think about. We should vote on that. We should bring it to light. We should ask more questions. As businesses, you can see the opportunity of how it can be helpful to you in understanding your customers, understanding yourself, making better decisions. But you should also ask, as a customer, do I want to live in a world where when I go to sleep and Alexa sits next to my bed and I don't know that she is not doing something to my head when I'm sleeping? That is the ethical conundrum that we're all kind of struggling with. And my hope from this talk is that if you take nothing from the neuroscience in the sense that you don't change anything about how you do business, you will take the idea that we're entering a world where the brain becomes a commodity, where we become hackable creatures. Anyone can essentially get into our brain and understand us, and that this changes everything. I'll say one more thing, and then we're gonna take a pause for this to really land. In the days of mythology, there was this big sign at the entrance of the city in Delphi that says, "Know thyself." And this was a virtue that people were after. Philosophers would spend a lot of time talking and kind of getting to understand themselves. This was great. In the many centuries that passed since, knowing ourselves became a luxurious thing. So people who can afford it may go to therapy and talk about themselves and get an insight into their mind. Some would do art, and this would be a way to understand their mind. Some would meditate. There are many ways to get into your mind. All of those get us access into who we are, but this still was a privilege. Like, you don't have to do it. You can live a perfect life without digging into your brain. But now we're entering a world where our brain becomes something that everyone can access. And in that sense, sentences we used to have before that assumed that you know your mind and it's only yours are changing. We had sentences like, the customer is always right, meaning the customer knows in his or her mind. The voter knows best. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder. All of those suggested that you know that if we kind of leave you alone, you dig into your mind and you come up with the right answer because it's yours. If someone can hack into your brain and change your own thoughts, then we don't really know that we are in charge of our own mind. And in that sense, I think that the world could be very difficult if we don't regulate that, put some barriers on that, and decide how it should look. And for that, I call on every person who's in this webinar to think what they want and ask questions, raise it in a conversation with their friends, and really prepare for that so that when it becomes a reality, we already have a say on that. That is my request from every person who is listening to us today.
That sounds like it's the next frontier of data privacy.
I agree. That is kind of the fear that I experience when I think about those ideas.
Yeah. So if you were to advise our audience on what they could do like defensively to not be susceptible to, say, the intervention you described in the grocery store, what can they do to prevent, whether it's hijacking or it's that influence that they're not aware of?
Okay, so I'll give you a few thoughts that come to mind. First of all, I said earlier something that I want to emphasize: beware of asking whys, meaning the manipulation works, but it gets cemented in your brain when I ask you why and you come up with an answer. So if you constantly try to explain to yourself every action and give yourself a narrative, you're doing the work for others. You actually are the one putting that thing. One of my colleagues has this beautiful idea that he says, we can argue and it's allowed mid-argument to reverse position. to say, you know what, I'm changing my, despite me saying all those things before, I want to now reverse position. And even as a game, let's try to do that and see if I can defend the other one. Debaters do that often. This is an exercise that allows us to, for a second, see things from a different perspective, and for a moment, give opportunity for the brain to recalibrate to different ideas. Most of us have a political opinion, it's fixed, and we are rarely open to hearing the other side because it's so cemented in our brain. If you play the game every now and then of give me 3 things that you like about the other side, you will find that first it's very hard. You immediately reject them. You say, yeah, but not this. And if you really play it to the extent that you allow your brain to do that, you will see that your brain is able to actually see a richer opportunity. So that's one. The other one is use others. The more we share our thoughts with a community, we're more likely to actually preserve the original one, such that if I overwrite too many times, my peers, my students, my colleagues will tell me, you know, you said the opposite a few months ago, and this will, if enough of them will tell me that, I say, okay, you know what, now there's a chance for me to actually kind of believe that I may have changed, and I don't know that this change came from me. And the third one, and that's the one that I'm toying with right now myself, is imagine it's April Fool's. I don't know if everyone knows that. April Fool's is April 1st. It's a kind of a day where people supposedly are pranking each other and kind of telling lies and embellishing stories and so on. I was with friends on a journey a few months ago on April Fool's, and one of them told us a story that made no sense. And because it was April Fool, I immediately said, you know what, when I hear this story, I'm gonna hear it with skeptical eyes, even though I like you and I trust you, because today is a day where you might try to fool me. In a way, I feel that we should play this game every now and then with our own mind. Every couple of days, say, like, let's look at my thoughts right now and see, could this be a thought that is not really aligned with other actions I have, and I wanna visit that. And if you play this game occasionally, you will find that some things require change and some things might not align, and that's the point to kind of open your mind to new ideas. And of course, I would end with one more idea. Neuroscience, the tool that I'm advocating for, actually allow us to see the moment where memories get changed, to take snapshots of moments before and after, and see potentially, so if this became a tool that was commodity and common practice in people's life, then we might actually have a way not just to get in, but also to get copies of the brain and save states and know that they're okay.
Thank you for that. Those are, I think, important parts of our arsenal as we just think about formation of opinions and perspectives. You know, one of the things that's fascinating about this conversation today is the many ways that it connects to other webinars that we have. So, you know, much like synapses connect neurons, I wonder if you might draw some connections to some earlier webinars. For example, when you talked about sleep, Fred Harburg, when we talked about resilience, had sleep as one of the most important things a leader can do. And so I would, if you could offer 1 or 2 connections to other webinars, I think that would be enriching to our audience.
Sure. When I was seeing the previous webinars, I kept thinking, oh, I have something to say to that and to that and to that. And it's because the brain is kind of everywhere. I think that we had a webinar about relationships by Eli Finkel. And what we're learning more and more from looking at the brains of people is that we can actually decode similarity between people by looking at their brains. So when we talk right now, if my message resonates with you guys, it means that my brain and your brains are actually very much in link. They operate in a similar wavelength. They think alike. And in that sense, we can now measure multiple brains and tell if people are excited about the same ideas, if they share thoughts, if they finish each other's sentences, if they can work as a good team together, and also if they're going to be good partners. So that is aligned with one talk that I've seen. We've seen a talk by Nosh, a colleague of mine, a contractor, who spoke about his research on NASA astronauts and what isolation does to your brain as they prepare to go to Mars. And from the same astronauts, we now have data that looks at their brain. And we can ask questions that are very relevant right now, which is, what does being alone do to your brain? So we can look at people who spent a lot of time in the same room in a tube, basically, and how they operate cognitively over time. And we can almost see who's declining faster, who's taking over, who's getting more power from the social interaction, who's getting less. We can actually start getting insights into that. And I think that even in the context of last week's webinar by Lauren Rivera, she spoke about the fact that essentially there are things like fit between people and cultures and so on, looking at the brain, we can add one more lens into that by essentially taking a lot of people and seeing when they are exposed to an idea, do they interpret it in the same way or not? So presumably, when people that are not similar are seeing something, it's not just that they reject one or the other, they actually see different things. They in the same content, see different angles. And now we can tell a couple while they're watching that, you know what, you didn't understand the same things. So here's what your brain saw, here's what your brain saw, let's help you resolve that. When the 10 of you look at the same problem, you're not seeing the same thing. And this one is the one you should turn to because she is seeing it differently. And if you're looking for a creative option, she might have it right now because she has a different lens on the same problem. So in the context of fit and solving problems as teams, we can now use the brain as a tool for that. Okay, so what I hope you take from that, from the hour we spent together, are some of the ideas. I hope that you're gonna think about the ethical problems and actually bring those to light. But also as business managers and owners, I want you to think that there's a new tool out there that could be at your service. Now, I don't expect people to leave this webinar and just go and toss away what they did before and replace it with the brain. But I want you to consider the 4 things that brain offer that could be useful as you think about using it in the future. Is it cheaper? Is it faster? Is it more accurate? And can it get you things that you cannot get otherwise? Meaning neuroscience can get you some things in a cheaper way. If you're asking a question by a survey or by looking at the brain, sometimes looking at the brain is faster. In those cases, it might be a good idea. Sometimes it's faster. You just look at the brain while the person is watching a movie and you know right away what they want. You don't have to get at that other ways. Many times it's more accurate. So if you ask the question and you look at the brain, the person would give you a complicated answer, but the brain will just give you the correct answer right away. And sometimes the brain can give you things you cannot get from asking, like the insights into a person's thinking and cognition and emotion and confusion and awe and remarkable things. So what I want you to take from this webinar is that there's a new tool out there that is emerging. And I want you to keep your fingers on the pulse such that every couple of months you Google or search something about neuroscience and business, see what we neuroscientists are doing, and see if it's actually helpful or relevant for your business. That's my hope for you.
Thank you, Moran. And I know that you're going to provide us with some resources that people can access that we'll put in with the recording when we post on our web. As I sit here and I think about a webinar series as part of an institution dedicated to education, how fascinating it has been, and I think I've used that term several times today, but meaningful and insightful to spend the hour understanding the very epicenter of how we learn and how we can take that to the next level, whether in business, whether in our own physical and emotional well-being, and in our lives in general.